One. One, two. One. One. 1, 1, 2. 1, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1. 1, 1, 2. 1, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 1.
Good morning. The committee will come to order. Before we begin, on a personal note, I just wanted to congratulate Mr. Levin on his marriage over the August recess. And wish him the best.
Well, thank you very, very much. A few of us have talked a bit about it, and you and I have, and I think the best way. Mike! I should turn it on? Pamela may hear. But anyway, thank you, and thank all of you for your best wishes, and especially from you, David.
Well, thank you very much. And
You've
also,
known our family for a long time.
Yes.
We've known you.
You've got a great family. I also wanted to mention Mr. Herger is not here because he had hip surgery over the August recess. He's recovering well, and we hope to see him next week. But I wanted to acknowledge why Chairman Herger wasn't here. The committee will come to order. We're meeting
Mr.
today
Chairman?
to consider.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr.
If I could, I just want to welcome you back.
Well, thank you.
And tell you that we're all very concerned about and very interested in and very supportive of your quick recovery. And you look good in that hat. And
I'm not quite ready for my full reveal yet. But Mr. Brady is counseling me that it's not so bad.
Mr. Chairman, might I add, you and I talked, the two of us, and I think my only complaint, you're cheerful, and you and I discussed the prognosis, which is so favorable. So my only hesitation, it's not a Detroit Tiger hat.
No. I had one, unfortunately, but without the padding, it was a little rough, so I had to take it off. But I was wearing a Detroit hat for quite a while.
Well, I thought maybe it was a reflection of the fact they're not doing so well when you are doing so well. So I think what we should do, all of us, even those of you who are not Tiger fans, and I'm going to try to arrange it when I come back next week. I'm going to bring you a very well-padded Detroit Tiger.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
What size?
Any size.
Smaller than it was, I'll tell you that.
Well, the chairman yield. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the members during my absence. I had no idea that it was a life-threatening attack on my spine when I was going through all of this. And I just want you to know that God has been so good to me, and medical science has gone far beyond what I ever thought it was. And when I first heard about you being attacked and being so young, vigorous, and having the right attitude and the progress that medical science has made, at my age, I believe everything is possible. And so this is what used to be a serious ailment has now become a damn inconvenience and a setback. So I join with your family, your friends, and everybody in wishing we can put this behind us and move forward, so we're really getting some serious political fighting and do what's best for our country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this.
Mr. Chairman, since Mr. Rango has spoken, and I'm afraid the moments after this aren't going to be very light, so let me add another light note, if I may.
All right.
Mr. Rango and others informed me that while we were away, his portrait shrunk. And it was, I guess, because of the air conditioning in this room.
Right.
And so I just want you to know, Mr. Rango, as we gave our affection to you, Mr. Chairman, I think we should say to the former chairman that our affection for you has not shrunk. And I guess they're now stretching the picture and will come back when it's placed again on the wall.
Well, let me thank you, the chair, and everyone else for your previous support and the fact the portrait will return. I just thought the portrait just couldn't take it anymore, but But thank you so much for your kind remarks.
Yes, they are repairing the painting, and it will be returned. We're meeting today to consider H.J. Res. 118, a resolution to block the Obama administration from changing work requirements in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families TANF welfare program. Americans strongly believe that those who are able to work should work in exchange for receiving federal benefits. A recent survey revealed that 83% support a work requirement as a condition for receiving welfare. The best way out of poverty is a job, and it's critical that our laws both foster job creation as well as ensure that welfare is always a pathway to work. Work requirements were central to the success of the bipartisan 1996 welfare reforms. Those reforms led to more work, more earnings, less welfare dependence, and less poverty among low-income Americans, and the reforms were unmistakably successful. For example, employment of single mothers increased by 15% from 1996 to 2000, and it remains higher today than in 1996, even after 2 recessions. At the same time, welfare caseloads have declined 57%. However, with their July 12th announcement, the administration moved to undo the success of the last decade and a half and allow states to waive the welfare work requirements that are at the heart of the TANF program. To make matters worse, the administration's proposal to waive these important work requirements is illegal. The 1996 legislation signed into law by President Clinton does permit an administration to waive certain requirements in the welfare program, which we'll hear more about today. But the work requirement is not among those provisions, and this was intentional. As one of the authors of that bill with Congressman Clay Shaw, I can tell you that we purposely drafted the law to ensure that work requirements couldn't be waived because of their importance in moving individuals from welfare to work. It's also important to recognize that work requirements have been seen as a mandatory part of the TANF program since its creation 16 years ago, and that no prior administrations, HHS secretaries, or governors of either party have ever claimed otherwise. The summary of the 1996 reforms, Committee Print 105-15, prepared by the committee staff immediately following the law's enactment, probably says it best, and let me quote, "Waivers granted after the date of enactment of the 1996 law may not override provisions of the TANF law that concern mandatory work requirements," end quote. There's no ambiguity here. There's no administration may waive the TANF work requirements. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle will argue that we're misinterpreting the administration's announcement and blowing things out of proportion. They may say that the only waivers that will be approved are those that lead to greater numbers of welfare recipients finding employment. But the logic behind the proposed waivers just doesn't hold up. Why would they need to waive the federal work requirements if their goal was to move more people into jobs? Increasing work and the resulting caseload declines are already counted towards states' work requirements. So if that's their real intention, current law satisfies that goal. The simple fact is increasing work is not the goal of waiving the work requirements. Instead, expanding how many people receive benefits appears to be the goal, and that's no accident or anything new to this administration. And beginning with the February 2009 stimulus bill, the administration's taken repeated steps to increase the number of Americans collecting government-provided benefits across a range of programs like welfare, unemployment, food stamps, health care, and various refundable tax credits. A review of government data confirms this reality. As a report I released on August 21st shows, the Obama administration is engaged in a systematic effort to undermine the work requirements that were already a vital part of a smaller number of government programs such as welfare and food stamps. These Obama administration changes have not only been enormously expensive, costing over $500 billion since 2009, but they've also disadvantaged millions of families by removing breadwinners from the workforce and making it far less likely they'll be able to return to productive, well-paid work in the future. The TANF program provides low-income Americans with temporary and necessary assistance as they transition into the workforce. The federal work requirements have been at the core of the success of this program, and by passing this resolution, will help ensure they remain so. While the continuing resolution being debated on the House floor today would extend being debated in committee today would extend the TANF, or the House floor actually on the TANF extension today, would extend it for 6 months. The purpose of this resolution is to ensure that work requirements remain a critical focus of this successful program. I look forward to today's discussion and to the progress of this legislation in the coming weeks. Before I yield to the ranking member for any statement he wishes to make, I ask that all members' opening statements be included in the record, and without objection so ordered. Mr. Levins recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is not about process or policy, but politics. Pure politics, even worse, impure politics. This legislation is an effort to pursue a claim that has been so thoroughly discredited by independent fact-checkers. As indicated in the slide now on the monitor, PolitiFact.com says that GOP claims about the administration's proposals on waivers, and I quote, drastic distortion, not accurate, and pants on fire false. Factcheck.org says of the claims, and again I quote, distort the truth and are, in quotes again, simply untrue. News organizations have found the basis for this bill before us completely bogus. In quotes, welfare accusations are a despicable distortion, the Philadelphia Inquirer. In quotes, Romney's welfare claims, wrong, CNN. In quotes, Romney ad is baloney, county welfare official says, the Columbia Dispatch. Mr. Romney, again in quotes, hits bottom on welfare, the New York Times editorial. New Romney ad, in quotes, pushes debunked claim against Obama, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Facts are stubborn things, but apparently not as stubborn as the utter willingness of Republicans to ignore them. It raises serious questions as to their motivation on this bill. We have heard that Republicans don't like to be dictated to by fact-checkers. So let's consider the words of someone who was involved, indeed very involved, in the development and enactment of the 1996 welfare reform law. The lead Republican staffer working on the 96 welfare reform bill was Ron Haskins. I served on the conference committee. It was a real conference. The issues were difficult, and there were disagreements, including how to craft the work requirements and how much flexibility to give to governors who wanted considerable flexibility. Ron was involved in these controversial deliberations, but no one challenges his knowledge or diligence. As indicated on this slide, Ron Haskins has said, in quotes, I don't see how you can get to the conclusion that the waiver provision undermines welfare reform, end of quotes. He was talking about this bill, this proposition. He also has said, in quotes, there is no plausible scenario on which it really constitutes a serious attack on welfare reform. And he continues, first of all, the states have to apply individually for waivers, and they have to explain in detail why this approach would lead to either more employment or better jobs for people who are trying to stay off welfare or get off welfare. President Clinton, by the way, who's now featured in, I think, an ad of Mr. Romney, was instrumental in bringing about and signing welfare reform into law. He summed up the issue succinctly when he said recently, and I quote, the administration agreed to give waivers to those governors only if they had a credible plan to increase employment by 20%, and they could keep the waivers only if they did increase employment. The requirement was for more work, not less. As I said at the outset, this bill is not about process. The majority has suggested that HHS does not have the authority to provide waivers, but a memo from the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service says the agency's action is consistent with prior practice. Republicans have also said that HHS did not follow a requirement to officially submit the guidance to Congress, but what they failed to mention is that there has been a long-standing difference under both Democratic and Republican administrations between federal agencies and the GAO as to what actions constitute a rule for the purpose of the Congressional Review Act. The purpose of the Obama administration proposal was to increase the number of people moving from welfare to work. Both Republican and Democratic governors indicated interest in waivers that would help them achieve this very goal, including the governor of Utah. It is often said that it's important for people in public office to disagree without being disagreeable, surely a necessity in a Congress so widely criticized by the public. But to make that work, disagreement cannot be a result of one side's dishonesty. This bill is dishonest. It should be rejected.
Thank you. Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.J. Res. 118, providing for congressional disapproval of the administration's July 12, 2012 waiver of welfare work requirements, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the resolution will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now turn to Mr. Matt Whitinger, Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Human Resources, to provide the technical description of H.J. Res. 118. And I'd ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Whitinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the legislation before the committee, H.J. Res. 118, is relatively short. It states that Congress disapproves of the rule which HHS first issued on July 12th relating to waiving work requirements in the Tanf program, and that, quote, such rule shall have no force or effect, close quote. The resolution therefore disapproves of the administration's attempts to waive the work requirements in Section 407 of the Tanf statute. The work requirements resulted from changes in the 1996 welfare reform law, which this committee and Chairman and several other members principally drafted. The 1996 reform law replaced the prior Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC program, with the new Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF block grant program. Importantly, prior to the enactment of TANF, many states had sought waivers of AFDC program rules so that they could test work and related requirements for welfare recipients, which otherwise would have been prohibited under AFDC rules, which provided for an individual entitlement to welfare benefits, among other restrictions to those sorts of policies. The bipartisan 1996 TANF reforms created strong new work requirements for persons receiving welfare benefits, as well as states. These requirements specify the minimum number of hours or related activities an individual must engage in each week, how work activities are defined, what share of adults on welfare must engage in work or related activities, and penalties for failure to comply, among other requirements. These were significant changes from the prior rules under AFDC, which did not contain similar requirements. Furthermore, Congress included several provisions designed to prevent the new TANF work requirements from being waived. First, it moved the work requirements and other key provisions out of Section 402, the only section of TANF that Section 1115 of the Social Security Act suggests may be waived. The work requirements were placed in a new Section 407 of the Social Security Act, which is not cited in Section 1115 as a section that can be waived. Second, it substantially revised Section 402, again, which is the only section of the TANF statute that can be waived, dramatically shrinking the section to one detailing primarily how a state must submit a written document that outlines how the state intends to operate its TANF program, instead of a former much larger section containing major AFDC program provisions. And finally, to be absolutely clear, as the Chairman noted as an opening statement, a summary of the 1996 welfare reform law the committee published in November 1996 stated flatly, Waivers granted after the date of enactment may not override provisions of the Tanf law that concern mandatory work requirements. A companion resolution to H.J. Res. 118 was introduced on Tuesday in the Senate by Senator Hatch. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough.
Thank you, Mr. Wettinger. I would like to place into the record letters dated September 4th and September 12th, one from the GAO September 4th and from the Congressional Research Service September 12th, both saying that the administration action was in fact a rule. Mr. Wettinger, the welfare reform law was passed by a Republican House and Senate in '96. It was signed into law by a Democrat president, as Mr. Levin pointed out. It was historic and bipartisan. It was a great achievement. And often when there are significant changes in the law, key committees like Ways and Means, which had jurisdiction over the TANF program and its work requirement, issue a document summarizing changes so that everyone can understand what changed and why. And we did that in 1996, and I'd like to read again from an official Ways and Means Committee print that was published in November of 1996 to explain exactly what each provision of the new law meant. And that report said about waivers, which was entitled Summary of Welfare Reforms Made by the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act and Associated Legislation. Waivers granted after the date of enactment may not override provisions of the TANF law that concern mandatory work requirements. It's a fairly simple, straightforward statement. Am I missing something here? Could this be any clearer?
I don't believe so. I think the statement stands.
The authors of the welfare reform law clearly meant that its work requirements could not be waived. Has this area of the law been changed since then to suggest, has Congress acted in some way, passed legislation to suggest the work requirements somehow now can be waived?
No, Mr. Chairman, there have been no legislation added to the TANF statute related to waivers since 1996.
I've also looked through HHS's rationale for waiving work requirements, and it looks like they're claiming they can waive anything mentioned in Section 402, not just the state plan requirements that states must submit, that states submit to an annual plan in writing to HHS, but how they intend to operate their TANF programs. And I'd like to just kind of explore in a little more detail what that would mean. Could states choose to waive penalties if someone refuses to engage in work?
The information memorandum that HHS issued on July 12th is a little vague, but it generally says that the work requirements that exist in 407 could be waived by reference through 402. My understanding is that includes any of the provisions, including penalties.
So penalties are a part of Section 407.
That's correct.
And it's your view that if you interpret their guidance that states, that HHS would have the authority to grant waivers on the penalties if someone refused to engage in work?
That's correct.
What about limitations on how long states can count looking for a job as quote-unquote work?
Also waivable. In fact, the information memorandum from July 12th includes certain secretaries' priorities that actually anticipate additional activities that are not work being counted for more time under waivers.
And if the logic in this HHS memo were taken further, could states then count looking for jobs indefinitely as quote-unquote work under this proposed waiver authority?
I believe so. It's certainly not excluded by the Secretary's guidance.
How many hours would someone have to spend in activities to be counted as working under this waiver authority?
Well, under current law, there are specific rules regarding hours that someone has to work. Generally, it's either 20 or 30 hours, depending on the individual case per week. The waiver presumably would allow states to waive that and allow fewer hours of work to count as work.
It was a very important point on the legislation that states engage at least 50% or half their caseload in work activities. That was it was one of the central issues on welfare reform. If you look at this guidance, could states change that to some smaller share as a result of this memorandum?
Again, I believe so. In fact, the letter that the Secretary issued to you and Senator Hatch in response to your inquiry after the information memorandum even goes beyond that to suggest a totally different regime than what exists in the Tanf statute as far as work participation requirements for the current caseload. It anticipates states doing something related to work exits, and that 20% nominal increase in work exits would permit the states then to waive the underlying provisions of Section 407.
Under current law and under the Welfare Reform Act, there was a limit on how much of the caseload could be counted as work by going to school. And under this guidance, what if the state wanted to send every welfare recipient to college for 4 years or longer? Would that, under this guidance, count as satisfying the work requirement potentially?
Again, potentially, and the Secretary's information memorandum sets up her priorities that states be allowed, or actually encouraged in her view, to count more education as work under the new waiver policy.
All right, thank you. Are there any further questions for Mr. Whiting?
I do.
Mr. Levin's recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, I think we should look at the definition of work activities. I mean, this was very much worked on, and they're listed, and they include a number of things, including on-the-job training, job search and job readiness assistance, community service programs, education directly related to employment. And it's because of that that the governor of Utah on July 16 wrote to Secretary Sebelius and said this: in discussion with HHS officials, Utah suggested that we be evaluated on the basis of the state's success in placing our customers in employment while also using a full participation model. This approach would require some flexibility at the state level and the granting of a waiver. So the whole purpose of this proposed waiver was to increase the number of people who were moving from welfare to work. And in the letter that was sent on July 18th by the Secretary, there's this sentence: specifically, governors must commit that their proposals would move at least 20% more people from welfare to work compared to the state's past performance. That's why, essentially, what's being argued here, what the purpose of this bill is reflected in this ad that was placed before the American people. And I quote, under Obama's plan, you wouldn't have to work and wouldn't have to train for a job. They just send you your welfare check. That's a lie. That's a lie. And that's why those who checked it give that pants on fire. The letter from the Secretary makes it very clear that if there is some flexibility, and there's some flexibility in the list of activities. We worked on this, and I just read from a few more. Satisfactory attendance at secondary school and a course of studying leading to a certificate of general equivalence. Number 12, the provision of child care services to an individual who is participating in a community service program. the purpose of welfare reform was to move people from welfare to work and to allow them to participate in work activities that might lead to that result. And that was the purpose of this proposed waiver. And that's why some governors indicated interest in it. And for those in political ads or otherwise to say otherwise, as has said by every political independent who has checked the facts, is essentially distorting for pure political advantage. And this bill is an effort to continue that, to essentially put through a bill in this Congress that would give credibility to an ad that is a lie. That's why we oppose it.
All right, Mr. Brady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this markup. It is so important because in America, I think the greatest inequality is between a person who holds a job and one who doesn't. The bipartisan welfare reform of the 1990s, in the work requirements specifically, were just critical to the successes of reducing poverty, reducing dependence on government, getting people back to work, especially those in low-income families, especially those with single moms struggling. And so I think it's the heart of this issue is the fact that we can't go backwards to the bad old days of welfare. We can't go backwards to the days where states counted as work, you know, personal care activities, massage, exercise, journaling, motivational reading. This is what states counted. It just seems to me, you know, getting your hair done, getting a massage, taking a jog, scribbling in your diary and reading "I'm okay, you're okay" is not real work. And it won't get you ready for a real job. And that's at the heart of welfare reform. And that's why it's so critical we continue to insist that people do their very best to get back on their feet and into a job with all the self-esteem that goes with that. So I want to fact check these fact checkers a minute, Mr. Weidinger. Some are saying that that states need this flexibility to increase and strengthen work requirements. But my understanding is that states can already do that. The only waivers they could seek would be to weaken the work requirement. Can you comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Brady. The difference between the AFDC program, or at least the waivers on the AFDC program and the waivers that are contemplated under the Tanf program under the administration's information memorandum, boil down to this. AFDC created restrictions from states wanting to strengthen work requirements. States then sought waivers to strengthen work requirements. The Tanf program created strong work requirements and that are minimum thresholds that states have to satisfy, and if they want to strengthen work requirements further, it is up to them without the need for a waiver. So, for example, in general, 50% of able-bodied adults on welfare are expected to engage in work activities, the 12 that Mr. Levin referenced. If states wanted to engage 75% of their current caseload in those activities, they are perfectly capable to do. As I mentioned before, the administration's July 18th letter anticipates something different. They anticipate something called an increase in employment exits, which has been discussed and former President Clinton actually discussed at the Democratic Convention. Let me read to you from a fact checker that the Washington Post put out on this question on Tuesday. Still, there is enough uncertainty about how the administration will implement these waivers that it is a stretch for Clinton to declare for certain that a 20% threshold must be met and to claim that more people will end up working under this new system. It is not quite so simple as that, and neither is it yet clear that the net result is that more people on welfare will end up working.
So so one fact checker just fact checked another in that point.
This is actually a fact checker who seems to be having second thoughts about his prior fact check.
Okay. That helps clarify everything. Let's fact check another claim. Many people are saying, in fact, I read this as well, that Republican governors, including Governor Romney, actually requested waivers of welfare work requirements in a 2005 letter to Senate Majority Leader Frist. My understanding, though, is that the letter that the governors, in their request, they wanted greater flexibility to actually increase work requirements. Can you fact check that fact check?
Yes. The 2005 letter pertained to a Senate bill called the PRIDE Act. PRIDE Act included provisions that suggested that states could better coordinate at least 3 programs, the Tanf program, the Social Services Block Grant, and the Child Care program. It didn't provide for waivers specifically or in any detail of the TANF work requirements. There have been similar proposals that Congress has considered and actually made it to the House floor in the past decade that would provide for the same thing. They would provide for program coordination. And in fact, the principle being that the TANF work requirements could be applied to other programs, not that the TANF work requirements themselves could be undermined. That's what that bill was about. And in fact, the PRIDE bill actually suggested that 50% work participation requirement for the current caseload be gradually increased to 70%. So that bill was about strengthening work and allowing states to better coordinate programs.
All right, thank you. Time's expired. Mr. Rangel is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Meindiger, for your observations here. When this was brought to your attention, was it basically to correct the July 18th letter, in your opinion, that the president issued as relates to work requirement and waivers?
I'm sorry.
I'm trying to find out the purpose in which this legislation is presented to us. Was it in connection with the president's letter that this is supposed to correct?
I'm not aware of a president's letter. The Secretary of HHS issued a letter in response.
Is that what you're here to correct?
The
Waiver.
resolution before the committee makes reference to the July 12th information memorandum. It does
Let
not
me
make
ask it another way. Does Governor Romney's commercial TV ad, have you had a chance to observe that?
Not recently, Congressman.
Not recently?
No, sir.
Well, that wasn't my question. Have you seen it at all?
I believe I saw it some time ago.
But when you saw it, do you remember what was in it, or you've forgotten what the substance?
I was just reminded by Congressman Levin of the verbiage.
And that helped you refresh your recollection? Do you recall that it had a hard-working, middle-class guy there with leather gloves during that ad? Did you see that? Do you remember seeing it?
Don't remember that detail.
No, you don't remember that. But if I told you that it was there to show the resentment that hard-working Americans have against people that are freeloaders, you wouldn't challenge that it was in the commercial, would you?
I would take your characterization that it's there.
Thank you. And did it infer, or did it say that what we were doing here, if I'm reading it so to help you with your answer, President quietly announced a plan that would gut welfare reform by dropping work requirements. Do you agree with that part of the commercial if it said that? Do you believe that this would gut the welfare reform program? Please.
I think,
Mr.
well, I would
Chairman.
just say, I think he's really here for technical support on the
This
resolution.
is about as technical as it gets.
And I think,
Okay,
maybe you could
we'll
try to
bail him
rephrase it.
out. Listen, do you know someone who's your colleague? What was Ron's name that we work so closely? Do you know Ron Haskins?
Not only do I know Ron Haskins, he's a friend of mine. Yeah.
No. Is he a qualified expert in this field that we're discussing here? Because none of us are expert except you and he and others like him. Is he an expert? And if you do know him and respect him, does he agree with what you've just said? Does he believe that this would gut welfare or that it's bad, as the commercial said?
He is one of many qualified experts on this topic,
Yes.
and he has said several things about this.
Yes.
Yes.
And some of them contradict what you've said, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me ask this. Do you believe that this legislation is to prevent people from just receiving welfare checks and going back to the old welfare by dropping work requirements? Because that's what the commercial said. The commercial said that unless we had this legislation, it would drop work requirements and go back to the old system where you just get your welfare check. Is that true?
Mr. Rangel, before the July 12th information memorandum, I don't believe anybody believed that there were waivers of the TANF work requirements that were authorized in the TANF statute.
Do you
In
believe
fact,
that's an answer to my question that you're saying now?
Yes, sir.
All I'm asking is that without this legislation, do you believe that people will not be required to work, that all they do is get this government check?
if a
While
state-
other hardworking people are paying taxes to give this freeloader a check. Now, that's what people are saying.
Mr. Rangel, if I was a state welfare director and I wanted to design a program under this waiver authority as outlined by HHS to do that, I believe I could. So yes.
You believe that unless we vote for this legislation, that the law as it exists today has no work requirements at all you do, even though you're able to work and don't want to work, that you will be able just to receive a welfare check. This is what you believe as a professional.
Mr. Rangel, that will depend on states submitting an application to do that. However, before July 12th, no one believed that a state had the authority to do that.
If a state applies for a waiver, must it be in that waiver requirements of work to indicate that work is an essential part of the waiver in order to get the check?
Answer quickly because time's expired, Mr.
Yes,
Whitehair.
answer quickly.
It depends on how the state chooses to define that. It's currently defined in federal law. I can't predict how states will choose to define that, but they could define it quite differently and quite at odds with the current federal work requirements.
All right, thank you.
Mr.
Ger-
Chairman, sometimes our party asks too much of our staff workers in connection with legislation.
All right. Mr. Gerlach's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking back on the July 12th information memorandum, particularly with regard to under scope of authority, the second paragraph starting while the TANF work participation requirements, blah, blah, blah. Do you have that available to you?
I do.
Okay. As I read that paragraph, the department is making it quite clear that, quote, it has the authority to waive compliance with Section 402 requirement and authorize a state to test approaches and methods other than those set forth in Section 407, which contain the minimum work requirements. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Including definitions of work activities and engagement, specified limitations, verification procedures, and a calculation of participation rates.
Correct.
What is your belief as to what that language in that paragraph is saying?
Mr. Gerlach, that is in principle what Chairman Camp was asking me about in terms of the breadth of what could be waived under the administration's information memorandum. It includes things like penalties for failure to work, what the definition of work is, so as Congressman Levin mentioned, sanctions, you name it. Basically, it's what is the guts of the work requirement in the TANF program that's reflected in Section 407.
And the department goes on to state in that same paragraph that it will consider waiver applications to make changes, quote, intended to lead to more effective means of meeting the work goals of TANF. Is that correct?
That's right.
Not the work requirements of TANF. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as a result of using the word goals, does that open up opportunities for discretionary decision-making that might be contrary to what the current statutory work requirements are of the current law?
That's correct. And I'll also highlight the word intended. In several of these examples of administration statements, for example, the 20% provision that's been talked about moving more people from welfare to work, it says that governors must commit that their proposals will move. Well, governor could commit to almost anything. That doesn't mean that it will be so.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. McDermott's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A noted Republican once said, "The world will little note nor long remember what happened here today." He was wrong about what he said, but this is part of the Ryan Romney PR campaign we're involved in here today. All us Christians up here on the dais know that the gold standard of law are the Ten Commandments. And none of them have ever been changed. But we've now found a new gold standard here, a new gold plate that has a law on it. It's the work requirements in the welfare law. The Congress, this is a miraculous day. We have created a law that could never be changed by anybody. It is the perfect final word. There isn't a governor, there isn't a member of Congress, there isn't a president, there isn't anybody who could improve upon the work requirements that were passed here in 1996. Now that's 18 years of perfect law. And we are here devoted to protecting that perfect law. Now, this bill was meant to divide Americans, to stoke the resentment between the base of the Republican electorate, particularly that group of people in the commercial, those workers, those out there, those uncollege educated workers who think that the government just gives checks to people and doesn't demand anything. It is absolutely untrue. The law's been there for 16 years. It's the gold standard. I mean, it's never going to be changed. And there isn't a governor in this country who could think of a better way to fix things in his state or her state, because we have the gold standard. One size does fit all. The federal government, in the form of the United States Congress, has passed a law that will never be changed. Those work requirements were perfectly written. Think of that. You are looking at people who wrote a perfect law. It is amazing. I know there aren't many people watching this on C-SPAN, Mr. Chairman. It's really too bad, because this is an example of the Congress doing its very best work, dividing the American people. They want, the Romney campaign, Mr. Ryan's with them, want the American voters to believe that this president is against work and he wants to encourage laziness. That's what this is all about. That's the campaign theme. If you elect or if you re-elect Mr. Obama, you're going to have people sitting around waiting for their checks, their unemployment checks and their welfare checks, and they're just waiting for their check, their Social Security check, doing nothing. That's what the message is. It is raw, pure cynicism, and it is shameful. Now, one of the members who isn't here today, Mr. Ryan, when he was here in 2002, he wanted waivers. I mean, but now he's out pushing the other side of this. The fact is that we have never written a perfect law, and we never will. We can't anticipate. We couldn't anticipate that the Republicans from 2000 to 2008 would run this country into the ditch by doing 2 wars and reducing taxes and deregulating the banking industry to such an extent that we wound up in the recession of 2008. And we have a whole new class of folks out there who have exhausted 100 weeks of unemployment and still can't find work. They are losing their houses because of foreclosures, and the Republicans don't want to do anything about that. They don't want the banks to be given. We've got a law on the books that says if the bank gives you a reduction in your principal, we're going to tax you on that as though it was income to you. And it's expiring in January. And we're sitting here saying to those guys on that commercial, if you lose your house and the bank writes down your loan, you're going to get stuck with the taxes on the money that the bank gave you. If they reduce it by $100,000, you're going to get taxed on $100,000, because we ought to be doing things like that in this committee, not passing this cynical piece of PR legislation that'll be all over the country on Friday and Saturday when we pass it. I yield back the balance of my time.
All right. Before I yield to Dr. Bustani, I just wanted to point out that You know, I've been in the minority twice, as my friends on the other side have, and been in the majority twice, as my friends on the other side have, and this was a significant part of the law, the work requirement. And the issue is not that it can be, should it be changed, but should it be changed by an unelected agency without informing the Congress? Now, clearly what the GAO says is that the Congressional Review Act says that the purpose of it is to keep Congress informed of rulemaking, because rulemaking becomes law, and that's done by unelected people. And so before a rule can take effect, they have to submit the rule to each House of Congress and the Comptroller General. They did not do that. They just did this informal informational memorandum. That's what we're objecting to. It is the prerogative of the Congress, frankly, I believe, to change something as significant as this. I don't think it's appropriate for rulemaking, but if it is appropriate for rulemaking, they need to follow the rules. So with that,
disagreement about that. I mean,
there is not. Both CRS and GAO say this is in fact a rule. Their action is a rule. And I think we want to protect the prerogative of the Congress here. I realize this is in the backdrop of the presidential campaign, but frankly,
this bill isn't about
having been, it is. What we're saying is, this is a simple resolution that says we're rejecting the rule because they need to come back to us and publish it in the Federal Register. They need to inform the Comptroller General. They need to follow the procedure that's been set out in law. The agencies are not above the law. But anyway, with that, I'll recognize Dr. Bustani for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find that I completely agree with what you just said. It was very eloquently stated. And I have to say I'm somewhat amused by some of the commentary from the other side of the aisle. This Congress makes law. And I agree, no law is perfect and it can be subject to change, but it should start here, not with some convoluted, arcane, obfuscated, bureaucratic process if it has real import. We have to take our job seriously, and if we're a nation that relishes and respects the rule of law, then let's do that. But lawmaking starts with Congress. Now, Mr. Whitinger, some have said that we should trust the administration in waiving work requirements because they've said they won't approve any waivers that undermine the current work requirements. In fact, some even say that we can rest assured because the administration told Chairman Camp in a letter they won't approve any state request unless it can ensure at least 20% or more people will go from welfare to work as a result. Where is that policy? Is it in the law, in regulations? Could you explain that?
To the best of my knowledge, it only exists in a July 18th letter from Secretary Sebelius to Chairman Camp and Senator Hatch.
So it's not in law, it's not in regulation, it's not even in program guidance from the agency. Is that correct?
That's correct. It didn't exist in the July 12th information memorandum that the Secretary sent to the states.
So does that policy have any force?
That
if it's not in the law, not in the regulation, not in program guidance, does it even matter what they said?
Apparently the Secretary thinks that it does, but it's not in the law.
Thank you. And what if the administration changed their minds, which it seems like since an anonymous administration official told the Washington Post fact-checkers in a September 11th article that this is an iterative process? I mean, given the way they read the law, are there any effective limitations on what they could approve to count as work?
Well, I can't fully define what an iterative process is as far as the administration is concerned, but I do know that there were differences between the information memorandum that the administration issued on July 12th and the letter to the chairman on July 18th. So in just 6 days, they added a 20% work exit requirement, and what would be the next stage in the iterative process is something I can't project.
Well, I thank you. I think the chairman stated very eloquently our position on all of this, and that is we have to protect the integrity of the lawmaking process. And this committee has a strong responsibility, a deep obligation to do so, and that's what we're here about today. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield back.
All right, thank you. I believe Mr. Doggett has his, I think you're the next, or has Mr. Neal? I'm sorry, I'll go in order. Mr. Neal's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the previous testimony of the chairman and Mr. Bustani. I hope that the Republican Party, when they talk about the prerogatives of Congress, will recall that philosophy when they continue to push for a line item veto. when they continue to push for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, or those who would prescribe giving up the notion of earmarking because it can't be done professionally. So hold the emotion on those issues of congressional prerogatives for a party who's been only too eager to give those prerogatives away. Now, I chaired the Democratic position in 1996 on welfare reform at the request of Dick Gephardt. Lynn Woosley assisted me. Where Mr. Whittaker is sitting today, Bill Weld sat, John Engler sat, George Pataki sat, and I don't recall whether or not Tommy Thompson was here, but their consistent request was flexibility in allowing the states to determine how to address the issues of welfare, because they were riding pretty high across the country on that very issue. The work requirement that we discussed here was based upon experimenting at the state level. Some states having different challenges as it related to implementation. But the universal request from Republican governors across the country was that they be granted flexibility in implementing their own welfare plans. I don't know how, in the midst of a campaign season, and let me point something out, this committee is not a political convention. One of the great sources of personal and professional pride that one gets from serving on this committee is that we hear from the best witnesses in America, that we stand apart from other committees because we have frequently to do very drill-down policy. Now, I supported that welfare law based upon two things. If you recall, President Clinton vetoed that law twice. What were his demands? The first demand he wanted was very clear, and that was housing assistance. He wanted the work requirement to include educational incentives. Transportation was a part of it. But how states would tabulate the 5-year requirement on work was to be left to them. That's the key consideration. Now, let me just close on this note after having cited those Republican governors who asked for flexibility. I'm going to quote Neil Newhouse, who is Governor Romney's pollster. We're not going to let our campaign be dictated by fact checkers. The private lament that every one of us on this committee and every member of the House of Representatives have when we talk to each other privately on the floor is this: I can't believe in the last campaign my opponent said this. I can't believe that they're saying that because there is no referee with the news media any longer. So what's the result? Half-truths, vague promises, and demagogic politics become the substitute for substantive dialogue. What's being done here today is nothing more than a political motivation to try to embarrass the president based upon what Republican governors asked for: flexibility.
Mr. Teaberry is recognized.
Tough act to follow, my friend from the state of Massachusetts. But I think there is a bit of difference here, and it's not about politics. My governor in the state of Ohio chaired the conference committee on welfare reform, chaired that conference. His interpretation is there was supposed to be flexibility, but not about this issue. And ironically, in Ohio, there's an article today in the Columbus Dispatch about this very issue. And our governor, who chaired the conference committee, said that work and not waiving work requirements was essential to making welfare reform work. He's now a governor. Today, Ohio announced, for the first time since 2007, we have met the federal work requirement. For the first time, we have more people working than anytime since 2007, when the economy over the last several years, according to the president, fell off a cliff. Now, how can that be done? Because you have a governor who's committed to the work requirement. But I understand. I understand the passion from the other side about this issue. I get it. The only thing I haven't heard is George Bush's fault or the oil company's fault.
Gentlemen, yield.
I won't yield. But to the witness, I want to get some information from you or confirm some information from you, because it appears as though there is a philosophical divide on this issue. This is not about politics. There is a philosophical divide about this issue. And my colleagues on the other side have had a history in the short time that I've been here of trying to weaken the work requirement. And in fact, if the witness would tell...
The gentleman yield.
I
Give me
want
one
to finish, and
example.
if I have time, I will yield.
Give me one example.
Well, that's coming. So I'd like to ask the witness if he could expand upon the stimulus bill that was passed in 2009 as it relates to a temporary law weakening the Tanf work requirement as it applies to requiring fewer people to work or train for a job for 3 years. Not forever, but for 3 years.
That's correct. The 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, sometimes called the stimulus bill, included a provision that amended Section 407 of the Social Security Act, the work requirements, to say the following. If states increase their caseload for, I believe it was 2009, 2010, 2011, those caseload increases would be ignored for purposes of determining what share of the welfare caseload was expected to engage in work. So remember, there's the 50% requirement. So if the caseload in the first year was 100, and then it went up to 120, say, instead of having 50 people in work activity, you'd have to have 60 people in work activities. The stimulus law said, no, you would only need to have 50 people in work activities because you could continue to base it on what the prior caseload was. So clearly that expected states, despite rising caseloads, to engage fewer people than they otherwise would have had to in work activities.
That's one example. Can you give me another example as it applied to the stimulus bill and unemployment compensation?
Sure. The provisions in
program.
the stimulus law on unemployment included a variety of measures. One was a $7 billion modernization fund that was only payable to states to the degree they expanded eligibility for unemployment benefits, including the various categories, people who are seeking only part-time work, some people who may have quit their job for certain reason, and so on. So clearly an attempt to, and what states had to do to gain that money, they had to permanently expand eligibility for benefits. It wasn't a temporary measure in that case.
So first one temporary, second one permanent. Can you comment on, I think, a third program within the stimulus bill with respect to food stamps and the work requirement that was weakened by the Obama administration?
Sure, not our jurisdiction, but the food stamp program has had since 1996 a work requirement after a period of time for what is called able-bodied individuals without dependents. That was waived, in effect, by the stimulus law. So individuals who were able-bodied and didn't have dependents could continue to indefinitely receive food stamp assistance, at least for, I believe it was 1 year in the stimulus law.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Michigan. I gave 3 examples.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to this gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
We'll be glad to tackle each of those. Each of those. The third, for example, is not an effort to weaken the work requirement. You referred to an article...
All right, time has expired.
Well, you referred to the Columbia Dispatch. It called the Romney ad baloney.
No, I referred to an article in the Columbus Dispatch today that I will submit for the record saying Ohio may avoid welfare penalties because of our increased work
It also
Without
called,
objection.
it called the Romney ad baloney.
Without objection,
That same
that
newspaper.
document will be entered into the record. Mr. Becerra is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Widener, thank you very much for your assistance in helping us sort through this. Let me first try to be clear on something. I've read the administration's information memorandum, and under purpose, it does state HHS is issuing this information memorandum to notify states of the Secretary's willingness to exercise her waiver authority under Section 1115 of the Social Security Act to allow states to test alternative and innovative strategies, policies, and procedures that are designed to improve employment outcomes for needy families. Under the information section, scope of authority, they go on to say HHS will only consider approving waivers relating to the work participation requirements that make changes intended to lead to more effective means of meeting the work goals of TANF. Further down, the next paragraph, any demonstration projects approved under this authority will be focused on improving employment outcomes. Now, this legislation is described as providing for congressional disapproval of the administration's July 12, 2012 waiver of welfare work requirements. Can you point out to me in the administration's memorandum where it says they want to waive welfare work requirements?
If you look at the subject line of that information memorandum, it starts out guidance concerning waiver and expenditure authority under Section 1115.
Right.
And then if you flip to the information section, it clearly makes reference to Section 407. That's
Right,
where the
I understand it makes references, but where does it say that the administration is trying to waive welfare work requirements?
Well, welfare is the TANF program. This is about the TANF program. The work requirements are in Section 407.
Right.
It says, thus HHS has authority to waive compliance with this Section 402 requirement, and immediately above that said, ensure that parents and caretakers receiving assistance under the program engage
Right, but you
in
know
work
very well that Section
activities in accordance
402
with
relates to
Section
more than
407.
just one aspect of welfare. 402 talks about, Section 402 speaks to many different things, as does Section 407. There's never any reference in the administration's information memorandum saying that they want to waive, as this legislation says, waive the waiver of welfare work requirements. I've looked through it. I keep trying to find where the administration is trying to waive welfare work requirements. And I just read to you specifically from the memorandum where they say that the purpose of the memorandum is to allow states to test alternative and innovative strategies, policies, and procedures that are designed to improve employment outcomes for needy families. And as I said before, HHS will only consider approving waivers
relating
that
to
make
the work.
changes intended to lead to more effective means of meeting the work goals of TANF. So I know that they're trying to make sure that states have better success in putting people to work, but I'm trying to figure out where you're saying, where is there any reference in what the administration has issued that says they are trying to waive welfare work requirements?
Will gentleman yield?
No,
Gentleman yield on this point?
If I could get Mr. Widener to answer, then certainly I would yield to
Be
the
glad.
If I may, Mr. Becerra, you skipped a couple of words.
Yeah.
In that last sentence of the second paragraph under information scope of authority, as described below, however, HHS will only consider approving waivers related to the work participation requirements. You skipped those and went on to say that make changes intended to.
Read the rest of it.
This is under which paragraph?
This is the second paragraph under information scope of authority, the very last sentence. As it's actually the sentence you were reading, Congressman Becerra.
Is this the sentence that the terms and conditions will establish consequences for failing to meet interim performance targets, including but not limited to?
No, it's the paragraph above that. It says, the last sentence, beginning with as described below.
HHS will only consider approving waivers relating to the work participation requirements that make changes intended to lead to more effective means of meeting the work goals of TANF. So they're not going to waive any requirements of the any of the work participation requirements unless those proposals by the states lead to more effective means.
Will gentleman yield on that point?
Certainly will yield.
Just read a couple sentences before that, sir. It says, the HHS has authority to waive compliance with this 402 requirement, referencing the sentence before that, which says a state plan is required to ensure that parents and caretakers receiving assistance engage in work activities in accordance with Section 407.
I understand that. If I
So the next
reclaim
section,
I'll
next
reclaim
sentence,
my
excuse me,
time.
I'll
I'll
finish
reclaim
my
my time.
sentence.
I'm going to reclaim my time. What it says is
California has the time.
So it's
the
being
Secretary
waived by
has
the
the
next
authority.
sentence.
The Secretary
Gentleman
has
from California has the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Secretary has the authority to do any number of things, but never does the administration's memorandum state that it's going to waive work requirements. It's going to give the states the ability to come up with programs that will enhance the ability of the states to employ more people and the department, HHS, will monitor and collect evidence to show that that's what they're doing. Otherwise, they can't participate. But the purpose of everything I've seen from the memorandum from the administration is to enhance work participation. Never do they talk about waiving the requirement that there be work that is
Time has
expected of those individuals who are on welfare.
Mr. Roskin's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to maybe put this in another context, too, there's been a lot of discussion about flexibility, and clearly there's a need for flexibility as it relates to the administration of a program, but we would argue not flexibility as it relates to the actual work requirement. And to put this into a larger context, I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the requests that have been made by several of the welfare agencies that are run by various states in a recent submission to the American Public Human Services Association. That is the organization representing state welfare administrators across the country. These are requests that were proposed requests of flexibility back in December 2010. One was the flexibility to exempt anyone from a work requirement during their first 2 months collecting a welfare check. Another request was flexibility to exempt anyone receiving transportation or child care assistance from work requirements, or flexibility to exempt adults receiving, quote, child-only welfare checks, which includes about half of all families on Tanf, from work requirements. There's two others: flexibility to exempt anyone from work requirements who's applying for disability benefits regardless of whether they're disabled or not. And finally, flexibility to define work however the state chooses, which might include activities, this is rich, such as getting a massage, bed rest, participating in smoking cessation classes, which some states have counted as work before 2006. This is not abstract. This is not theoretical. These are requests that people with a straight face have come forward and allowed themselves to be associated with as work requirements. Now, I think the clear reading of the language, the articulation of that definition by Mr. Gerlach takes away all the ambiguity. There's nothing to be defensive about here. There was a misstep on the part of the administration to offer flexibility, which was a mistake. It was a mistake on a grand scale. It was a mistake by a bureaucrat in the context of a political campaign that was a big, big error. And rather than getting uptight about it, let's just make this thing go away and say, we don't believe this. You don't believe it's a good idea. Let's just knock this thing out of the park. We should all come together around this. This is a very simple thing. And let's say we need to make sure that in this environment, we're not weakening work requirements. And if the administration doesn't want to weaken the work requirements, just have HHS take this thing off the table. It was an error on the part of the administration. The best remedy is for HHS to back off. If they're not going to back off, then let's hold our ground. But as a Congress, let's not be complicit in ambiguity and penumbras and all sorts of little schemes to weaken the work requirement. This isn't complicated. We should pass this on a unanimous vote. I yield back.
All right. Mr. Doggett's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thought you had an excellent opening statement about the purposes of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Act. I agree with it this morning. I agreed with it in 1996 when we moved from welfare to workfare and viewed this as a temporary program. I also agree with you that there are dangers in giving the states too much flexibility sometimes. Certainly we have seen that in Texas as these monies often go to a state just to fill its budget gap rather than to fulfill the responsibilities of federal law. Left unspoken in this discussion is that with reference to temporary assistance for needy families, over 70% of the federal dollars do not go in welfare checks to people. They go to the states for a variety of purposes, sometimes just to fill a budget gap, but to address the needs of abused and neglected children and a variety of other things. And only about 29% of the dollars are actually in monthly checks on a temporary basis to citizens. The chairman and our Republican colleagues have also correctly noted that there are real dangers in having too many changes by unelected bureaucracy. And indeed, since you asked us about the Bush years, I think there's not a better example of the dangers of too much power for unelected democracy than we saw for 8 years in the Bush-Cheney administration. How is it that we got to the current point of using the waiver approach? The same way we got to the current status of using the waiver approach to try to correct the failures of the No Child Left Behind Act, because this Congress did not do its work, did not exercise its responsibility in preserving the integrity of the lawmaking process, as one of our colleagues said. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program expired over a year ago, and our Republican colleagues couldn't decide how to extend it. They couldn't get agreement amongst themselves, so they did it in stops and spurts. And so we're now coming up to a deadline with the act not having been renewed, with issues concerning what the best way to achieve more work for individuals who have received temporary assistance. This isn't about whether to have work. This isn't about the value of work. It's about how we achieve the objectives of getting more people to work and providing them those opportunities. Now, the administration, somewhat belatedly, came out with this guidance. And it came about as a result of a number of governors, including Republican governors in Utah, for example, saying they were spending more time filling out federal paperwork than they were helping people get to work. And so they have suggested that they need a little more flexibility in order to achieve the objectives of work. Now, perhaps there is a fear that Republican governors will come in and ask for massage, jogging, and feel-good sessions as an alternative to work. The secretary who is responsible for approving these waivers has said quite clearly she is not going to approve any waiver that doesn't get at least 20% more people to work, trying to achieve the same objective that the chairman talked about. The only response to that this morning is, well, she might change her mind. Her name is not Romney, it's Sebelius. And I think she's going to stick by what she said and not change at every moment that there's a new constituency to talk about, and that the use of this approach only works in a narrow, limited basis if it will actually get more people to work. Now, what this resolution should really be called is the Desperation Act, because failing in so many particulars, the notion that there are hardworking people out there that are having to make while other people take, that they're welfare Cadillacs, that they're welfare queens, that they're people loafing and freeloading around. It just works so well at these political conventions. It works so well in these 30-second ads that you just keep saying it in a fact-free environment. It doesn't make any difference whether there's any truth to it. There's that old mythology out there that predates the 1996 change in the law that you want to promote. And so you keep promoting it in a way that is just as the incredible comments of Governor Romney yesterday in the midst of our foreign embassies being attacked, that just keeps promoting it without regard to whether there's any truth to it or not. And you have not just anyone, but the Republican staff director who sat here in '96 saying it's not true and saying he's talked to 42 states and that this is all about more work, but all we have on television are more lies. I yield back.
All right, thank you. I don't have anyone else seeking recognition at this time. Oh, you're recognized. Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very revealing session that we've had here, and I think some moments of great levity even, and openings for even greater camaraderie, and even moments of kumbaya. And yet, one can't help but look and give this what I would call the Augie and Ray's test. So what we have here is Republican governors and other governors seeking a waiver. They seek a waiver because they want to make sure, whether it's paperwork or whether it's the bureaucracy that they're operating under isn't giving them sufficient flexibility. Something that we've seen our own esteemed colleague from this group, Paul Ryan, asked for, something that presidential candidate Romney asked for. Also, as Mr. Neal pointed out, and at the hearing here, and whether it was Governor Weld or Governor Pataki or Governor Thompson at the time, because flexibility is something that they require. The response in turn by the administration was to make sure that they got that flexibility, especially in these difficult times. Because as we sit here, not taking up the President's jobs bill with more than 12 million Americans still out of work, I can understand why this is a vital concern. Those governors should get the flexibility that they need, but also with the requirements, as Mr. Doggett pointed out, that Secretary Sebelius wants to make sure that they get more people to go to work. That seems to me to be a pretty clear objective. But as Mr. Neal also points out, there's a word here, I guess a two-letter word that's become an enigma to the other side, and that's called fact check. And so when we go down the list, and no matter who it is, as Leader Levin put on the board, or no matter who says it, with respect to the facts, this kind of dialogue continues to persist. Frankly, I don't think it serves us well. We have the ability as a committee, as Mr. Neal pointed out, to come together and do things in a very constructive manner that will put this country back to work, that will allow us to continue to move forward. Legislation of this nature, and I take my colleagues at their word and the integrity that so many of them bring to this committee, is to improve it. But when taken in the context of the moment, when taken with the background of being pummeled by political commercials, as my grandfather Nolan would say, trust everyone, but cut the cards.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell is recognized. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I'm going in order. I didn't realize Mr. Blumenauer had wanted to speak. We'll go to Mr. Blumenauer first, then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And welcome back. I just am a little uncomfortable as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, which so many of us aspire to because of its important work, that we are spending so much time on something that is apparently just an effort to bolster a false presidential ad, to give it some sort of underpinning of credibility. I'm perfectly willing to allow the administration to give requests from Republican governors for more flexibility to meet this objective. And I long for the day that we get past the election and we can get back to our work, making these programs move forward and refining them on areas that we agree with, and not exercising time like this.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Pascrell?
Mr. Thompson.
Oh, Mr. Thompson. He's recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for having to step out. We have an Intel hearing going on at the same time. But I wanted to come back on, and I don't know what all has been said other than what my colleague, Mr. Blumenauer, had just mentioned. And I concur with his line of thinking. This is political poppycock, and we ought to recognize it for what it is. I wrote and had passed and signed into law the welfare reform legislation for California when I was in the state Senate there. And one of the things that we did is we made sure that we had, that the work requirement was important and was on the books. And that was one of the most important things about welfare reform in California, as it was with the federal law and every other state. every state legislature, every member of Congress who worked in this wanted to help people get from welfare to work. That's what it was all about. And to suggest that states shouldn't have the latitude to ensure that this happens is just nonsense. And as Mr. Blumenauer just pointed out, the reports that I've seen suggest that it's Republican governors who have asked for flexibility and more latitude to make this happen. So to come in and do this bill, I think just smacks of everything that's wrong with what's going on right now. If we want to do something about work requirements, we ought to look at the work requirements for the Congress and keep us here for the next 4 weeks to get some real work done instead of messing around with this stuff, and I yield back.
Mr. Pascrell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Whitinger, in the Romney ad on television, interesting ad, key red flagged words throughout the entire thing, as both sides do, we know that. Well, we're talking about welfare and we're talking about waivers to work requirements. And in that ad it says, and I'll take it out of context, but you know what comes before and what comes after. The thing that really strikes me in that ad, and the thing that really strikes me about this hearing are the words, quote unquote, they just send you your welfare check. I would like to know what your thoughts and opinion and comment are on those specific words. They just send you your welfare check.
Mr. Pascrell, if I may, Mr. Whiting is here to answer questions about the specific resolution in front of us.
Well,
perhaps if you could be more specific to that point, I think he could be helpful.
I don't fear that it's fair for you to judge where I'm going on this, and I'm talking about what we're voting on today.
I was asking perhaps if you could be more specific on a certain requirement, he could be helpful.
I gave him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words, and I want to know what his opinion is since he's seen the ad. Then I have another question. The second question is going to be, what is the motivation of the administration then? If you're correct, and Mr. Romney is correct, and Mr. Ryan is correct, and my good friends on the other side are correct, what's their motivation? I got 2 questions for you. I think they're specific to this proposal today that's before us. And I'm not going to gloss over, Gumbaya. Let's get to the facts, put it on the ground. What does that mean?
Mr. Pascrell, I'm not sure if you were in the room when Mr. Roskin went through his list, but the administration's waiver information memorandum opens the door to states applying for waivers of the work participation requirements. Mr. Roskin went through a list of proposals from a group called the American Public Human Services Administration. It's the umbrella group for the State Welfare Directors Association around the country, so it includes all the state welfare directors. He went through requests that the states had for Tanf reauthorization, which would be a reasonable guess of how states might want to pursue waiver authority if it were granted by HHS. Some of the categories he described included flexibility to exempt anyone from work requirements during their first 2 months collecting a welfare check. Flexibility to exempt adults receiving child-only welfare checks, which include about half of families on TANF from work requirements. Flexibility to exempt anyone from work requirements who's applying for disability benefits, regardless of whether they're disabled or not. Those are examples of they just send you the check if the state wanted to move its program in that direction. I can't sit here and tell you that Connecticut or California or Nevada will do so, but the HHS information memorandum has opened the door to them doing so, which in the previous discussion I described didn't seem to be something that was conceivable before.
Then, Mr. Winninger, let me ask you this question. Since you've made a judgment here on this issue, and you obviously support the measure that's before us, I'm going to give you 2 examples, and I would like you to tell me how you would respond, and do you think a waiver is in order? Situation 1, a family with a special needs child might require work arrangements that are currently allowed, would you say a waiver was in order? Because we know a variety of special needs, kids need different situations, different times of the day. Do you think that you would grant, or in this discussion that we're having really, would you think a waiver was appropriate?
Well, first, my opinion about whether a waiver is appropriate
Work waiver I'm talking about.
is, I think, immaterial. However, I would point out...
Oh, no, it's very material to what you think. I think this is important, what you think.
Mr. Pascrell, under today's law and without waivers, states are expected to engage 50% of adults on welfare in work activities. The other 50% need to be doing nothing.
Well, what about this situation? I gave you a very specific, can't be any more specific than this. And I can give you another specific example.
In that specific situation?
Possibly a waiver or not.
States could already exempt that family from work if they wanted under current law.
There are waivers already that are given. Isn't it true, Mr. Wettinger?
There hasn't been a waiver to Tanf provided since 1996.
There being no further questions, are there any amendments to HJ Resolution 118? If there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report HJ Res 118 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the resolution. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
Recorded vote.
Is there support for a recorded vote? A recorded vote is ordered. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Herger, Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady,
Aye.
Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan, Mr. Nunez, Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry, Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert, Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani, Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom, Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach, Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price, Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith, Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock, Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins, Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson, Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant, Mr. Marchant, aye. Mr. Berg, Ms. Black, Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Levin,
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel, Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. Stark, Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott, Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis, Mr. Neal, Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra, Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett, Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson, Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind, Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell, Mr. Pascrell, no. Ms. Berkeley, Ms. Berkeley, no. Mr. Crowley, Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Herger, Mr. Ryan, Mr. Berg, Mr. Lewis, Chairman Camp. Chairman Camp, yes.
Thanks. Yes. The clerk will report the roll.
18 ayes to 14 noes.
The vote being 18 ayes and 14 nays, the motion is agreed to. HJ Resolution 118 is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views, and so ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.